Hello and welcome to the Global Innovators in Business series. In this series, we interview leaders and innovators from different fields to share their experiences and advice with undergraduate students to provide inspiration and motivation.
Today, we're so happy to have with us Pierre Paslier. Pierre is the co-founder and co-CEO of Notpla. With the goal of making plastic disappear, Notpla has been using biodegradable seaweed-based materials to change what packaging means. Thank you so much for having us. Thank you so much for being here. And so the first question we always ask Pierre is, what is one charity or nonprofit that you would like to dedicate this interview to? Do you have one in mind, and what would it be?
Yeah, so I'd love to give a shout to Five Gyres. They do a lot of work on obviously getting rid of plastic in the ocean, but also creating a lot of science so that we can have a better understanding of the actual implications of putting all this material in our oceans.
Got it. Amazing. So yes, we'll start with very early on in your background. Was there anything that you, like when you were before college, that you innovated in your house or like working on? Was that innovation spirit started from a very young age, or did that gradually grow as you went to college, as you worked at L'Oreal and everything?
I think I was always quite curious. Grew up in a very creative household, so there was lots of opportunities to do some DIY, lots of making, and I think that definitely played a huge part in being quite explorative with materials and not being afraid of changing the way things are always done. I really was interested in the world of inventions, people who create something that doesn't really exist yet. But I think that that was something that maybe faded out as I progressed along the classic curriculum, because that's something that is also less taught in school and less embraced in the earlier year of training. So it's kind of nice that it came back full circle when opportunities arise.
Why do you think those initial imagination, thought-based education, wasn't fully translated as you grew older and older in your educational career?
I think the problem is that the education system, at least in the West, I don't know too much about other places of the world, but it's the whole point is to teach everyone a bunch of known things, and a little part is about learning how to learn, but the most thing is just getting a lot of information of how everything else already works or happened or whatever it is. So it's almost like an unintentional consequence, but everyone is just for years getting knowledge one direction, and there is it's much harder to keep on empowering people to think that this is not always going to be like that. This knowledge is going to be evolving. There's going to be new things that are going to emerge. I think we've done a lot of progress, probably in the past 10-15 years, on embracing a little bit more of an open way of dealing with education, but that's still very much the case. So I think it's hard to keep that mindset throughout a very classical education.
Interesting. Yes, if you have any ideas on how to make that education more fitting for someone who's an innovator, please let us know. But also, what was one thing that you innovated when you were younger, or what is one project or what is one thing that's almost sparked your interest in I can innovate things on my own?
I didn't do it, but I really wanted, when I was a kid, I was playing a lot with Lego bricks. And I really wanted to create a special vacuum cleaner for Lego bricks, so that you don't have to sort them out. So that was one thing that I always thought, like, one day I'll make it.
Yes, stepping on Lego bricks is the worst feeling ever. So having a vacuum cleaner for that will be a great addition. I see. So then your first job was actually quite traditional. You was trained as an engineer. And how did you find your way to your first job? And what do you think you learned from that experience?
Yeah. So actually, when I kind of like graduated from high school, there was a first chance of kind of like going one direction or another. I was really interested in design, not understanding very well what design necessarily was, but I was always something quite interesting to me. And the problem in France at that time is that design really like taught by art schools, and you had to go through kind of like an arts degree. And on the other end, I was always kind of like really interested in engineering and more of the kind of like science direction. And those were seen as two very conflicting kind of like directions. And so there was a really hard choice of kind of like, do I like pursue more this arts like direction, or do I go for the engineering school? And following the advice of a very good teacher, who said that it's so much easier to kind of like bring the design with the arts kind of like flavor after having done an engineering degree, rather than having to kind of like bring engineering degree on top of like an arts degree. That felt like a much better kind of like strategic route. So I did that. So I did 5 years of engineering. I actually kind of like struggled quite a lot to find motivation, because it was definitely a very kind of like dry type of studies. But it did give me a good rounded kind of like engineering training, and I think that served me like in terms of credibility, maybe not as much as in terms of like skills learned. But actually, I think I've done like so much more engineering when I started to do more design than when I was kind of like in engineering school or engineering work. So when I graduated from the engineering school, I thought, what is a good kind of like intermediate like type of product that has a strong element of design, but also kind of like some applied engineering. And I thought packaging is a very fast-paced kind of like type of development of products, where maybe there will be a little bit more chance for me to have an input and get exposed and learn a bit more about these things. So I thought that it was making quite a lot of sense. I got an internship at L'Oreal, and then eventually I got a job there, and I worked on launching skincare products in packaging made from plastic for a couple of years in Paris. And that was really like great to learn the industrial scale of things, or all the things that you really just learn on the spot. You can't learn at school. But it was also very disheartening. I think maybe the company has evolved, but like back then it was very siloed. So there was zero chance of being exposed to the part that is not your core job. So the job of the packaging engineer ends here, and the job of like the marketing person ends here, and the job of the product designer starts and ends here. So that was frustrating, and obviously it was also something that was definitely not a passion for me. And seeing the unintended consequences of all this packaging being made, flying on the conditioning line at incredible speed, that was something that like really kind of like made me lose quickly interest once the technical learnings were gone. And that's when I realized that I wanted to kind of like do something a lot more kind of like purposeful. And that's when I applied for this Masters of Innovation Design Engineering in London, between the Royal College of Art and Imperial College. And when I got in, I quit my job at L'Oreal, and I came to London to study this master's.
So was there a spark, as Tony, as our team has described in like this entrepreneurial journey, there is sometimes like a spark that changes your path in one way. Was there a spark inside your work at L'Oreal that's led that transition?
There was a lot of like disheartening moments about just the scale of like plastic that we use, and there was one particular product, a cream jar, where someone in marketing thought that like the sound of the jar when you put it on your kind of like like in your bathroom on the surface, it sounded not premium enough. And so they wanted us to kind of like double the weight of plastic just so that the sound would be a little bit more premium. And that's when I was like, this is not kind of like, I cannot execute that and not kind of like feel that I'm putting my brain to use for something that is really wrong. So I think that was a moment where I really kind of like disconnected more with what was happening there. And I already knew that that wasn't kind of like the place for me to grow, but that was probably like a bit of like a moment of a turning point.
Oh, that's so interesting. Do you think, okay, don't want you to say anything negative, but do you think this same trend of like even using additional plastic to make the sound better or to like make a certain effect is still existent inside this type of industry?
I think there's been like a huge shift in the like, especially in Europe, in the US, I think like throughout the world. So there's a lot of things that are no longer kind of like as acceptable as they used to be. But I think the same things are happening around kind of like the so-called kind of like better alternatives to the good old kind of like petroleum derived plastic. So I think that there is a lot of greenwashing that is still happening that is almost worse, because now like it's a requirement of having some sort of kind of like environmental feature or credential, but the choices that are available aren't necessarily delivering on that on that front. And there's a lot of kind of like choices that are just about like ticking a box or getting kind of like the impression to the consumer that this is something better. The first generation of bioplastics are far from kind of like having any sustainability credentials, and yet they are kind of like being marketed and branded as if we had solved the problem. So that's almost creating more damage than other things. So I think while making like doubling the weight of plastic on like a bottle is probably like very rare nowadays in those companies, I think choosing like a solution that is not so good and then making a big kind of like marketing splash about it is still very prevalent.
I see. That's so interesting. Okay, so back to your story. You're at Royal College of Arts. How did you meet your co-founder and how did you come up with this idea?
So we were studying together in the same master. So we met kind of like first day. Was really interesting because it's a master's where everyone has a different background. It's very kind of like diverse kind of like backgrounds. So he's an architect by background and he's worked in design, like in different fields, had like studied in lots of different places. So super interesting to have kind of like the chance of working with him on a few projects along the way. And at some point, we kind of like started to work more precisely on this project. The initial idea was to create a man-made fruit, to think like if you're going to transport water, we have made this quintessential plastic bottle that's going to last kind of like hundreds and hundreds of years. Archaeologists from the future will find these things in like so many different kind of like places and be wondering like what was going on. Mm-hmm. And so the idea was like, if this was made from nature, what would it be? And the experimentation really started in the kitchen. We didn't have access to a lab or anything, so it was very very quick and dirty and very kind of like hands-on. And after trying a number of different plant extracts from tapioca seeds, different starches, different kind of like types of cellulose, anything we could get our hands on, we stumbled upon like the recipe for making fake caviar, which is actually like made from seaweed. So these tiny kind of like fish flavored balls that are really like much cheaper than real caviar. They were actually developed in the 40s by Unilever to kind of like create like a more affordable kind of like food product. And they use like seaweed to encapsulate, seaweed extracts to encapsulate this little kind of like dose of fish flavored water. And so all the patents are now kind of like long expired and available on Google. And so it was really great to be able to kind of like look at some of those old technologies and try to think with the angle of packaging, how do we get out of like the world of food and how do we make like a packaging product and proposition of it. So we started making the bubbles bigger and bigger, and eventually we made like some pretty big ones, like the size of a tomato. And to like, because we were using those extracts, the big surprise is that it's transparent. Even if it comes from seaweed, it's kind of like the flower part of the seaweed. So all of the fibrous part that makes it green and smelly is kind of like separated. So it was edible. So the cool thing that these bubbles were kind of like edible was that this was something you cannot do with any other type of like packaging. It's not really something that is even kind of like thought of that you could eat your packaging. So we made the first few kind of like videos, reactions of people, and we put it online. And to our surprise, people were really interested in this. And it kind of like went viral over the summer without us kind of like imagining that was going to be the case. It was a bit a student project that we wanted to wrap up, put it on our portfolio and move on to the next one. But it really kind of like grew to a point where people were saying this could really be a viable solution for packaging in lots of different applications. And so seeing the interest, and like at that point, our prototypes were very crude. It was still tasting very kind of like fishy and salty, and it was definitely kind of like not refined. But like people's reaction was really a big motivation to take this forward. And we thought, well, maybe we could give this another go and try to develop something that's a little bit more kind of like ready to test in the market. And so we applied to a bunch of competitions while we were finishing the second year of our master's. And we won a few of those competitions, which gave us a little bit of kind of like budget to spend on R&D. So we initially kind of like started working a bit more closely with some of the chemists and chemical engineers at Imperial College that were kind of like classmates of someone, or we had like different ways of finding our way into the unit to kind of like knock on the door of a professor and say, hey, could you do something about like resolving this problem with a little bit of cash that we got from this prize or this award. And so we thought like we were going to kind of like face a lot of challenges, probably like stop and then go and apply to get a regular job at like a tech company or whatever it is. But to our surprise, we managed to kind of like get some nice kind of like progress. It wasn't kind of like easy for the first couple of years. We were not paying ourselves, really kind of like struggling to convince people that this was a serious attempt, but we were also seeing the potential of having in our hands some better prototypes and seeing how it could really start to kind of like have a potential kind of like replacement for plastic. We started testing in like small races, and so that like for marathons, this was a great application. So we were like, this is really something that could replace a lot of plastic. It's worth kind of like continuing to give it a shot. And eventually, after a couple of years, and not having really managed to get any investment to start executing the plans that we were preparing, we decided to do an equity crowdfunding campaign. So basically, people could invest as little as £10 to buy shares of the company. So that made it very democratic for people to kind of like support us, rather than only being pitching to angel investors and VC funds who have like a much bigger kind of like ticket size. And to our surprise, like what was like months and months of rejection of those angels turned out to be a 3-day like campaign that like completely kind of like blew up. We raised $1 million in 3 days from 900 people from all around the world. People were really excited. There was lots of kind of like social media videos. One of them got 100 million views on Facebook. So we had like so many kind of like emails, and it was just kind of like unbelievable, the kind of like the difference from one day to another. So that was really like probably the starting point. From that point, we kind of like went kind of like full time on the project since 2017, and like started to kind of like grow like the team, get some more support on the different aspects that we were working on chemistry, engineering, design, like business development, production, etc. And that's when we realized that there were a lot of other things that we could be doing with seaweed. And so at that point, we kind of like grew to create a catalog of packaging solutions. So the ooho little bubbles, we still use them for marathons and festivals with cocktails or juices, and even with condiments for kind of like sauce sachets of ketchup and mayo for like deliveries. We're working on this with Kraft Heinz. But we also realized that there was some other ways that we could leverage seaweed to replace plastic. So we started developing takeaway boxes that typically have a thin layer of plastic on the inside. I mean, when you receive like a salad or like a curry or whatever it is, the inside of like a takeaway box has a thin layer of plastic to protect the cardboard from the grease and the water of the food. That makes the packaging non-biodegradable, non-recyclable. So we are replacing this with seaweed so that the whole thing is completely naturally biodegradable. And now we're kind of like doing it for stadiums and for takeaway restaurants and a lot of on-the-go consumption. We started to develop some films that we can make sachets of, transparent films that can be heat sealed for dry products.
So that's entirely biodegradable.
That's entirely biodegradable. This one is even like it's like a noodle bag that you can actually throw the whole thing into the boiling water of your pot, and it's gonna dissolve. And there is added salt inside, so it kind of like adds salt to your noodle. So we can do things with seaweed that you can't do with plastic, and that's kind of like the exciting thing. We can challenge a bit the status quo, and so those are kind of like example of the things that we want to bring to kind of like large manufacturing scale to commercialize in lots of different places and start having the impact that we want to have.
I see. How do you scale? So what is exactly inside like seaweeds, but what is exactly this material and how do you find it in the world? And how do you scale the production of this like not super common material?
Yeah. So a little bit on seaweed. First of all, seaweed is a really amazing resource. It grows for certain species up to 1 meter per day. So it's really like incredibly kind of like renewable. It doesn't require fresh water or fertilizer. So compared to agriculture, it's zero input. And when it grows, it actually sequesters carbon. So the leaves of the seaweed fall to the bottom of the ocean and they get trapped there for kind of like thousands of years. So it's actually actively kind of like decarbonizing the environment. And importantly for us, it's like edible and biodegradable. Seaweed was there before any life on land. Every kind of like tree, every kind of like organism really came from the sea. So it has had a lot more time to evolve, and for the rest of kind of like the living world to know how to decompose it very efficiently. So that's why it's extremely easy for end of life kind of like where humans might lose control of their packaging and nature has to kind of like deal with it. and so we've learned a lot about seaweed. There's more than 12,000 species of seaweed. And so all of these have very different kind of like components, and those components can be used for very different applications. So we actually use a lot of different species for different applications. To give an example of the differences of kind of like the genetic diversity that exists in seaweed, there is more difference in certain kind of like types of seaweed in their DNA than between a mushroom and a bear. So that's how wide of a spectrum we're talking about. Whereas we just call it seaweed. I mean, there's lots of kind of like families, but commonly we've always kind of like put it in just one giant bucket, but there's actually a lot of stuff happening there. So for the past 8 years, we've been working with lots of different seaweed farmers and extractors. We are mostly active in Europe, so we mostly kind of like have seaweed suppliers here, but we've also started to work all around the world. There's obviously a lot of kind of like seaweed consumption for food in Southeast Asia. So Southeast Asia is like by far the most advanced market for seaweed. They've been like running aquaculture of seaweed very efficiently for the past 80 years. So they are absolute masters, and the Western world has kind of like to play catch up on that. But there's some exciting kind of like growth around kind of like seaweed farming in Europe and in the US, in Maine. And so there's definitely kind of like a renewed interest for seaweed. And we hope that we can kind of like create an additional application to the many other benefits that seaweed can have on helping kind of like with cosmetics, pharma, medical applications, carbon sequestration, etc.
That's so interesting. When you say caviar, what do you mean by caviar?
So it's these like small kind of like fish balls that are like it's the eggs from the fish, but like
Yes.
the real ones for like from the beluga fish is like super expensive.
Yes.
And so Unilever at some point decided to create something that looks like that, but is definitely not the real thing. And so that food product, which is kind of like definitely like a man-made industrial process, used seaweed extract as a way of encapsulating those small kind of like those small kind of like droplets of fish flavored brine.
Interesting. I'm just thinking the marketing tactic of you're eating caviar every day, but in a different packaging. But that's kind of like taking like a product that's like less used and being able to scale it and finding the unique beauty, the unique amazingness of that product and leveraging that to like help the world in some way is something that is such a cool concept and to like capitalize on what our world has. Although for those who are not like material engineers or who don't have the access to know all these things, how do you recommend us look for opportunities that are innovative, and what is your mindset when you're thinking of an innovative challenge and a solution to that?
I think we've never had as wide of like an access to information, so it's about like like being curious. I think one of the things that was really amazing during this masters is that we were like 40 people constantly kind of like exploring some quite niche topics, and we were feeding on each other's kind of like interests. So that was a really exciting time for just being exposed to lots of really hard things to learn about. But so yeah, I think it's kind of like not being afraid of going a bit on the dark corners of like old technologies or what some kind of like relatively boring industries might have done in the past that was irrelevant when everything was ruled by petrochemicals, but now we are coming back to nature. So I think there's a lot of things to just do around revisiting some of the stuff that we did 100 years ago and seeing how they are relevant today, and also kind of like making jumps between like applications or industries. So what might work as a food product 100 years ago might be a great starting point for a packaging solution today, but it might be that like some pharma technology from like 50 years ago has a application for kind of like fertilizers or food. Or so it's about kind of like thinking of how do you take a block of technology and you repurpose it into another one. And then obviously you have to develop that and make it work, but that's one kind of like step to create a novel proposition.
That's so interesting. In a creativity class at Wharton, there was a professor called Ram Shrift, and he taught this idea of like using almost like an engineering mentality to like look at creative solutions and problems. And one of the ideas is taking something that's existing and trying to repurpose and using that to like solve other issues and what kind of other issues you can solve, and almost building a grid of like, these are the different industries, these are the different types of things, and these are different types of solutions, and if you use the solution for this problem, does it work? If you use it's a very, very like systematic mentality of looking at problems, but very, very interesting as well. Yeah. Do you have any mental models when you think of at work or when you think of problems that you use to help you make decisions?
Well, I think having managed to industrialize now like a couple of products, it's almost kind of like, I mean, the idea and the starting point is important, but it's so much about like implementation and kind of like getting everything kind of like working. So I'd say that it's about like not getting too obsessed over kind of like finding the right proposition to start with, because actually things will evolve along the way and there will be kind of like so much changes, but you have to be on that path. Like you have to go and like trial on big manufacturing lines with a material that they've never kind of like tried before, and things fail. And then from there, you have some sort of insight that you could do something else. Or, but like those things don't really happen unless you take that first shot. And so I think that, yeah, like sometimes that's a bit the pitfall of kind of like innovating straight out of university and not kind of like confronting yourself immediately to that industrial kind of like world, especially for making manufacturing physical products. I think digital is probably like quite different, but there's a big chasm that needs to be kind of like bridged. And I think that probably what took us those first couple of years, we could have gone much farther and faster if we had confronted ourselves with kind of like getting started and being kind of like ambitious and just making those opportunities happen faster. Like you can't redo history, and like this is the joy of being a first-time founder. I'm sure that like things fall into place a little bit more when you're on your second venture or whatever it is. But yeah, I think that like one of the big learnings is that it's really down to implementing your idea rather than kind of like having a very beautiful idea in the first place.
Down to having an idea rather than having a very beautiful idea in the first place. That's so interesting. I like, you don't need to like have like the most quality, but you just need to start and act upon it. I see. Thank you so much, Pierre. I'll open up it now to some of the questions that we have already, and also to my team. Do you guys have anything that you want to ask Pierre? Feel free to comment or type in the chat, or also say unmute.
I do have a question. Actually, I have many questions. I know that we can cut these interviews apart with editing and podcasts and stuff. So I just want to say before I get started, I was really excited when Chris told me that this interview was going to be taking place, because this whole innovation about biodegradable plastics is something that I'm personally really excited about, just because of personal passion about like the environment, you know, like eliminating microplastics and like the catastrophic human toll of plastic waste on the environment. So something that I'm really interested in is in retrospect, like being able to look back at this whole evolution of Notpla so far. And you say that this collaborative atmosphere in your graduate school, for instance, was a huge feature of the process and how you guys came about so many innovations while you were there. Does that translate to this world of startups at all? Like, are you collaborating with your competition at all? Or is there, because I know a feature of a lot of the innovators in this series is that with these innovative technologies and stuff, they're finding it kind of a whole different animal to navigate the world of bureaucracy and regulation in certain countries. And so I'm wondering if you have any advice about like working with or in tandem with your competitors in a burgeoning field like this.
For sure. I think we are kind of like very realistic that we're not going to solve this on our own. And also we're not going to solve, like, seaweed isn't going to be a significant packaging material on the market until there is at least 5 or 10 suppliers. Like, Unilever is not going to take the risk of shifting a large quantity of their packaging to seaweed if the only supplier is Notpla. So we need to create a healthy kind of like competition, which seems a bit counterintuitive, because it's great when there's like no one kind of like really on like your kind of like footstep, but equally we're very clear that we want to be kind of like coming on top of that industry, and like I think today we are, but that keeps us kind of like pushing and being kind of like fast and efficient. I think that the market is so big that there is no kind of like issue of not having enough kind of like room for competitors to work closely together, help each other with some of those kind of like unilateral kind of like challenges that you were mentioning around like legal challenges or the kind of like way people approach hygiene or kind of like safety or some of those topics that usually bring an industry together, even if you are kind of like at the end of the day competing in the market. So it's quite interesting to see that there is a number of like emerging coalitions and groups where people who are kind of like directly competing are kind of like working together on helping the whole ecosystem. Obviously, it's not easy because sometimes you've got to also kind of like make sure you retain a bit your head start. So it's not kind of like full open kind of like books with everything. But I think that definitely there's a lot kind of like willingness to help this grow all together, because at the end of the day, the people who are in this are also people who are here for the purpose and for the impact that they can have, and the impact that we can have if the whole kind of like system of like sustainable packaging grows is much greater than if one does okay and the rest are not kind of like really following. So I think that there is a nice healthy way of making sure that we achieve impact whatever it takes. Obviously, it's better if like Notpla is like a strong contender, but I think the main kind of like areas of collaboration are also with like not only the startup competitors, but everyone on our value chain. And that's where like in a way collaboration is key, is really like how do we get the like machine manufacturers and the seaweed farmers and the distribution hubs and the brand owners and the waste industry and the kind of like legislators to all kind of like come together around this. And that's the part where collaboration is key, but it's also very, very complex. And like yesterday I was on a like a panel trying to establish some guidelines for like plastic treaties in the UK. And when you have on the same room Greenpeace and the British Plastic Association, that's necessarily going to clash a little bit. But the fact that you could bring those people together, that's kind of like already half of the kind of like solution. So I think that yeah, like definitely super important to work together.
Another thing that I know that you brought up is that this is your first startup, and you talked about kind of like hammering out the whole process of running a startup and making the whole enterprise work while you're still in the R&D process for your product. Do you how do you feel about that? Like, do you sometimes wish that you had maybe committed more to like having the final product before launching Notpla, or do you wish that like you had more clearly like outlined the business before moving forward? Or I know we're kind of still in the middle of the early days of the company and the innovations that you guys have ahead, but and while you're here in the process, do you have any notes for that for anyone who might be listening?
I think this is one of the things that I think we're doing quite well at Notpla, is not waiting for every technical parameter to be ready to really kind of like push the rest of the proposition against the wall, or kind of like get an answer on it. Because too often we are kind of like obsessing over a feature that actually the market doesn't really care about. And I think that this is one of the learnings, is that you've got to challenge the brief that you're working on. We're not going to come with a spec sheet of a material that's going to be exactly like plastic, but also like very often plastic is completely overspec'd for a particular application. So I think that obviously you've got to reach the point where you have like a minimum viable product, but like that minimum viable product, sometimes you might put that bar higher than what is really needed. And I think that knowing whether or not there is commercial traction on something before you build it is even better. Like in software, that's like very easy. In hardware, it's a little bit more complex, but this is almost kind of like the commercial R&D side of things. There's the technical R&D, but like knowing whether or not this particular proposition communicated this way at this particular kind of like place with these kind of like audiences, does that work or not? And I think that's that's how we treat business development. It's very much like commercial R&D. And so, yeah, we try as early as possible to kind of like get some of that before we build like deep, complex kind of like features and solve challenges that require like years to resolve. Because otherwise you might just kind of like go in direction. It doesn't mean that it's a kind of like easy or comfortable position, because when you're kind of like getting traction on something that is not ready, you have to manage expectations. But this is the fastest way to make things happen. And like by working with some very kind of like open-minded commercial partners that really kind of like understand innovation and want to be on this journey with us, we are opening so many more doors than if we are on our own with like a plan, knocking on the door of like a big manufacturing partner and then saying like, you are the least priority we have right now. But if you come with like this big company that says, hey, I think there is something to do here, then they take you seriously, and then you have like their attention.
Right. Yeah. I come from a background of like working in food service and hospitality a lot, and so when I first heard about this project, the first thing that came to mind for me was like water and cocktails, and I know that's a big thing with the companies I've seen in your videos online, things that you're partnering with like Glenlivet and like big Scotch brands and stuff, which is not a small deal. I know that in food service and like hospitality, especially in light of the recent pandemic, that sanitation is a big thing for consumers, and the product, like from an ecological standpoint, makes sense because there's no plastic waste, you can ingest all of it. But how does Notpla work with that aspect of it? Like people who worry about other people handling this thing that they're going to fully digest. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So it's a really interesting topic, which interestingly enough is usually more kind of like of a theoretical kind of like question than like a behavior kind of like that we notice. Because the moment that like you've got in a room people kind of like trying the product, all of the concerns kind of like of how this is going to feel and how it is kind of disappear, because the big comparable that we have is fruits. So in a way, fruits have worked for kind of like millions of years, right? We are very used to kind of like dealing with them, and we are kind of like quite good at like transporting them in a relatively safe supply chain. And there's all sorts of kind of like things that have been working really well for fruits for us to keep using them even in our industrial age. And so very often when we work with a brand, we try to say, if your product was a fruit, what kind of fruit would it be? And let's make that fruit. And so when you take the kind of like the example of the fruit, actually you realize that by kind of like having like taking measures around how things are handled and where it's produced in a completely food grade facility, and the fact that it has a short shelf life, there is actually a lot less risk than some of the other products that we handle all the time. I mean, like we all put kind of like a can of Coke to our lips without thinking that this product was made 3 years ago in some kind of like factory, maybe kind of like on the other side of the country. It's been sitting in lots of different hubs and so on. But this is fine. Like this, the level of risk is low and it's well controlled. So this is a bit the same approach. We are kind of like creating a model where the risk is well understood and it's controlled and it's low. And because we work on events rather than retail, we really have kind of like this distribution element that makes it very safe, like probably safer than a can of like a soda. So that's how we handle this.
Right. Cool.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. That was just a few questions I had. I'm gonna get back in the back seat and let Chris get back to this. But thank you very much, Pierre.
Thank you, Pierre, for the answers, and thank you, Tony, for the like really, really good questions. Okay, anyone else have another question that they wanted to ask the team? Also, there's actually, they mentioned some questions beforehand, so I'll also like ask. So Kiki previously asked if you were to use a few specific attributes to describe the traits that are most common for innovators like you to have led in building something successful and coming up with these big ideas, what are these like specific traits that you think are necessary and crucial to like making that kind of person?
I think it's hard to extrapolate. I think there's one thing that is quite important is that you have like this drive or this passion for this particular product or this particular topic or this particularly kind of like particular challenge that you're working on, because you're going to be like living and breathing it for tens of years. So I think that that's very important. You have to kind of like find something that you're really passionate about. I think being curious, because yeah, like when at the very beginning you don't have any of the answers, so it's very much like a journey of like finding out like what else is possible or how else you can kind of like deal with this. And maybe the last thing is to kind of like surround yourself with people who are better than you at all of these things, so that you really kind of like build kind of like a super great team of people who are really nourishing you with their knowledge and like motivated to challenge the status quo, even if it's kind of like the way we've been doing things for a very long time. So I think that it's quite good to have like people. It's both good to have lots of experience that can like help you save years, and it's also good sometimes to have people with very little experience but the right kind of like mindset, because they're not going to be afraid of doing it a different way because they don't know the other way. So it's good to challenge that as well sometimes.
Thank you. Yes. Another question from the audience is that we know after learning more about you, you also do NFT drawings on the sides. You also make music. How do you combine all these interests into your time, into your life, and how do you like separate them and compartmentalize them so you can do everything at a very, very high level?
So I think those other kind of like creative activities are a bit the outlet for kind of like scratching the itch of creating and kind of like maybe finishing things. I think startups are a very long journey where you start and like there isn't really kind of like a moment where you're done or it's kind of like finalized. It's always kind of like growing and continuing. There's lots of really rewarding moments when you have specific events or like reaching milestones, but it's a very kind of like it can be a very kind of like intense process of not really ever seeing that moment of completion. And I think that personally that's one of my kind of like things that I really like to do, is having very short projects, very short kind of like little activities. And so generative art or kind of like music are ways of kind of like quickly creating something. It doesn't have to be kind of like very ambitious, but it's kind of like a way of getting that out of the system and finding the freshness of working on this very long and challenging kind of like problem of resolving packaging. And I mostly do it kind of like on the weekends. That's kind of like the moment of recharging the batteries. So I think that like I try like, and I inevitably fail, but like I try to be mindful of how I spend my time and not kind of like I could be kind of like watching a couple of episodes of something on Netflix, or I could kind of like make a little kind of like jam on like my synthesizer, or I could kind of like spend an afternoon just doing a generative drawing. That's something that I know is going to be more fulfilling for me and get that kind of like scratch that itch. So I try to be mindful of that.
I love that. I think so many students are struggling to like understand how to compartmentalize or how to like distribute time with so many interests. So like knowing that like doing something like creating art or creating music is a part of making your actual job better, helping to like get your energy and get your time to like release some of that stress, release some of that energy, and can help both things do better is a very, very good mindset to have. Anyone else from the team have any questions? Yes, Tony. Yes, okay. Well, yes, Tony, go ahead.
Going back to the early days, like before Notpla back in school, I know that you said that a mentor recommended that because you said your two passions were design and art and design as well as engineering, and your mentor told you that it would be easier to bring the art and design into an engineering aspect as opposed to the other way around. And then after that, going into L'Oreal, and you said that your whole experience there was all of your projects were siloed, and so you were made to work on this specific thing and not really allowed to flex your wings. Do you look back at any of these experiences and wish that you'd done anything differently, or is there anything about the whole process, the whole system that you went through, like the not just the sort of hierarchical business setup of L'Oreal, but your whole process of going through your education and the way that things were taught to you in school, as you said, the way that we were taught sort of what to think and not how to think and problem solve and address these issues. Is there anything that, if you could snap your fingers and change it, you would change for the next generation of entrepreneurs behind you?
Yeah, I think back to that advice, I think it was a really great advice because that was what was kind of like relevant at this time. And that was certainly true. I've kind of like seen how whether it's like pure skills or just kind of like credibility, going through that path has really kind of like been a very helpful asset to me. But I think that also things are changing a lot. I think that like the kinds of curriculums that are available are a lot more kind of like mixed, so that maybe I would have in a similar position be able to find something that is a lot more kind of like halfway house rather than just going like full engineering and then kind of like bringing the design. So I think that was a relatively rare kind of like master's back in 2012 when I went to the Royal College of Art and Imperial College. I think now there's like so many unis that are offering this kind of like mix of design engineering that is very relevant because you need those two things to work together. But I think also that like there is you can't plan things too much. Like careers won't be linear, and whatever you choose will be an asset at some point or kind of like a bit of a drag at another, but you can't really kind of like plan it so well beforehand. So I think it's also kind of like releasing some of that pressure that like you are like in full control of all these things. There'll be opportunities that arise and they are out of your control, and like you can control the controllables, but like those things, it's not because you've kind of like made that choice that you're not going to be able to kind of like do something else. And I think that the biggest thing is, I think the level of pressure that like people, and probably like myself at some point, but like people put on themselves of choosing one career path over another, versus how you see that at the end, it's all quite fluid. And if you have the motivation of kind of like going one way, you'll kind of like create opportunities for yourself to kind of like go there. So I think it's it's kind of like making it less important in the overall kind of like range of things. And if you have a particular interest, by kind of like studying it on your own, or kind of like getting exposed to whatever that particular like field is doing, and that's almost more valuable than necessarily finding the perfect degree that fits all of these things at once together.
Cool. Yeah. Very profound advice. Thank you very much. Speaking of advice, I think Chris is
Thank you, Pierre, so much. This is really amazing that you could take this time and speak to us. If you had just like usually our final question is just like if you have like one last piece of advice for students, even in like a very short form, what would it be?
I think I would say like try to really enjoy that time, because it can be quite easy to focus only on like the after. Once you've graduated and you're going to do this, you're going to do that, but like it's very kind of like special time where you have freedom. You're not kind of like constrained by the economics of like an industry that has to kind of like work a certain way, quarter after quarter you have to kind of like hit this or that. So I think that that's a very important and precious time for kind of like experimenting and kind of like finding out what you really are interested in and the kind of things that you want to do more of. And yeah, maybe linking to that last kind of like question, also kind of like taking some of the pressure off that like career paths are very kind of like unpredictable, and probably the job that you might end up doing doesn't even exist yet, and there's certainly no kind of like curriculum that like would prepare someone for doing that. So yeah, it's about being kind of like flexible and seizing opportunities when there is something a bit weird that emerges, to be able to jump on it and say, oh, that's interesting. I think that I can pull some of the skills that I've developed even outside of like uni to do something about it.